Ni hao. So in this video, which is part of my Chinese philosophy series, we're going to talk about Lao Tzu's book, The Tao Te Ching, which is the foundation of Taoism. Before I start, I do want to say I've got a new webcam, which is not giving me mirror view, so I'm a little bit freaked out about my new camera because everything looks like it's happening in reverse, and it's kind of throwing me off. So that's a forewarning. But anyway, so Lao Tzu is the founder of Taoism, theoretically. I say theoretically because it's not entirely clear that Lao Tzu was an actual person who existed. So somewhat like in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's disagreement about whether or not people like Abraham and Moses actually existed. There's disagreement about whether or not King Arthur existed in British mythology. It's not real clear that someone named Lao Tzu actually existed. We know some of his disciples, like Mo Tzu, existed. And I'll be doing a video on Mo Tzu's essay against music in a few weeks. But Lao Tzu may be this kind of imagined, idealized sage who gives advice that leads to the foundation of Taoism as a philosophy. So that being said, we're going to talk about Lao Tzu as though he's a real person, because that's what the tradition says. So Taoism is a philosophy that's largely based on sort of passive acceptance of things as they are, or of the way, we might say, the way in which the universe unfolds. It's a fatalistic philosophy in some senses. But basically the idea is that the Tao, which is often translated as the way, is beyond human control. That things are going to happen. The way is going to unfold. We can also think about this as the universe. The universe is going to unfold the way that it intends to, and as a human being, as a mortal person, you can resist that if you choose to, but you won't be able to stop it. So you can... There's a great analogy that I think kind of explains the Taoist philosophy, which is that if you're in a river being carried downstream, you can try and swim upstream against the current, but the river will still carry you downstream. So you can instead, and alternatively, you can choose to swim downstream with the current, and you will get to where you're going faster. But if you simply sit and let the river take you, then you will be taken to where you're inevitably going to go anyway. So this is the sort of Taoist philosophy. And we get that. So basically the Tao Te Ching is a number of poems. It's philosophy in poetry, which I think is absolutely brilliant. But we get a number of poems that specifically endorse non-activity, especially among rulers. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. So in Book 1, Poem 17, the best of all rulers is but a shadowy presence to his subjects. Next comes the ruler they love and praise. Next comes one they fear. Next comes one with whom they take liberties. When there is not enough faith, there is a lack of good faith. Hesitant, he does not utter words lightly. When his task is accomplished and his work done, the people all say, "It happened to us naturally." So this is the idea, this is Lao Tzu's idea about rulership, about being in charge or command of things, is that rather than being sort of forceful and aggressive and ordering people to do things, you create the conditions in which those things will happen. So this is the sort of central ruling philosophy. And if we think back to the video about Confucius's philosophy, we have here the same central anxiety about how to be a good ruler in an era when social norms, social stability are breaking down, when states are warring with one another, etc., etc. Because if Lao Tzu existed, he probably lived fairly shortly before Confucius did, and as we know, Confucius dies about 4 years before the beginning of the Warring States period. So both of these philosophers are centrally concerned with how you build social stability. And Lao Tzu argues, essentially, you build that stability by creating the conditions in which people's desires will be fulfilled, the people's basic needs will be met, etc., etc. And we can see that later on at the end of Book 1, poem 37, he says, "The way never acts, yet nothing is left undone. Should lords and princes be able to hold fast to it, the myriad creatures will be transformed of their own accord. After they are transformed, should desire raise its head, I shall press it down with the weight of the nameless uncarved block. The nameless uncarved block is but freedom from desire, and if I cease to desire and remain still, the empire will be at peace of its own accord." So we get here actually something really interesting, because in my interview with Rebecca Doverspike about Buddhism, we talked about the Buddhist desire to, or what am I going to say, desire to, the Buddhist philosophical principle of transcending desire. We see the same thing here with Lao Tzu, and specifically what he means when he says desire is the desire for luxuries, the desire for excess. So he's not saying if the peasants are starving but the ruler is inactive, society will be good. No, he's saying basically as long as people's fundamental needs for food, clothing, shelter, not being brutally murdered by criminals or warlords or whatever it is, as long as those basic needs are met, you can transcend desire, you can transcend that quest for luxuries that ends up being socially disruptive by stepping away from it. So, and that's one of the key things here, is rather than the rulers, so the rulers in this case lead by example in their sort of non-presence. So Lao Tzu in a way thinks that people's desire for luxuries is it's mimetic. It's based on seeing that their leaders desire these luxuries. So this is, I mean, whether or not this is true is an open question, but basically the idea that he has here is if the rulers step back from desiring luxuries and simply let the empire function, and he's working in an imperial context, so he does talk about the empire here. If they simply let the empire function, then people will be contented and society will be stable. Now, that's an important thing, because I was once talking to a friend about Taoism, and this idea of like passivity and allowing the thing that's going to happen. And the point that she made, which is a really important one, is that this seems like a great philosophy for controlling the population. Which is true. I mean, the principle of passivity, of allow what's going to happen, is in itself a kind of fatalistic and anti-revolutionary perspective. But again, the thing that bears emphasis here is that Lao Tzu is not... He has a philosophy for the common people, but his primary concern is not necessarily with the people. His primary concern is with how you lead a stable and effective society. So a lot of the poems here are actually about, for instance, the error of warfare. So, I mean, it's a pacifistic philosophy. In Book 1, Poem 30, he says, "One who assists the ruler of men by means of the way does not intimidate the empire by a show of arms. This is something which is liable to rebound. When troops have encamped, where troops have encamped, there will brambles grow. In the wake of a mighty army, bad harvests follow without fail. One who is good aims only at bringing his campaign to a conclusion and dare not thereby intimidate. Bring it to a conclusion, but do not boast. Bring it to a conclusion, but do not brag. Bring it to a conclusion, but do not be arrogant. Bring it to a conclusion, but only when there is no choice. Bring it to a conclusion, but do not intimidate. A creature in its prime doing harm to the old is known as going against the way. That which goes against the way will come to an early end." So in this case, he's saying that military action, especially unnecessary or boastful or arrogant military action, will destroy the person engaging in it. Similarly, in Book 2, Poem 46, sorry, they're in Roman numerals, and I'm not immediately always great at reading Roman numerals. "When the way prevails in the empire, fleet-footed horses are relegated to plowing the fields. When the way does not prevail in the empire, war horses breed on the border. There is no crime greater than having too many desires. There is no disaster greater than not being content. There is no misfortune greater than being covetous. Hence, in being content, one will always have enough." So again, we come back to this sense of the importance of renouncing desire or transcending desire, that you accept fate, the world, existence for what it is, and by accepting that, by acknowledging that the world is as it is, and by being content rather than attempting to accumulate, especially attempting to accumulate luxuries, then you create harmony in the empire, in your society, in the universe, whatever it is. And the other interesting thing about Lao Tzu's philosophy is that I talked about it as a passive philosophy, as being about passivity, but actually he acknowledges that weakness, flexibility, submissiveness are often more effective techniques than arrogance, violence, stubbornness, etc., etc. So in Book 2, Poem 43, he says, "The most submissive thing in the world can ride roughshod over the hardest in the world, that which is without substance entering that which has no crevices. That is why I know the benefit of resorting to no action. The teaching that uses no words, the benefit of resorting to no action. These are beyond the understanding of all but a very few in the world." And so, I mean, I think the sort of classic example of this is that water dripping onto a rock over maybe thousands of years, maybe hundreds of years, will wear that rock away. So this is a perfect Taoist image. The idea of water, very soft, very yielding, very flowing, versus a rock, very hard, very solid, very unforgiving, and yet, over time, the soft, the yielding, the fluid erodes the hard. erodes the stubborn.